We're going to look at evaluating software again, and we're going to go back to this idea of criteria to just kind of plant that in our heads, that before we buy things, we want to use criteria, even when it seems like a foregone conclusion, because we want to walk into things in a rational sense and have not just be rational, but have a rationale as to why we're getting something. So a key question is to ask is, what is it that you need to accomplish with your software? And is there a standard or a standard? Now, if there is, just use the standard. And an example that I would offer is, for better or for worse, Microsoft Word is, I would say, the de facto way of having creating documents and sharing documents throughout the world. I would say that Google Docs is becoming a de facto standard for collaborative work, where people are working on the same document at the same time and adding to it or changing it in some way. When we have something that is adopted by so many people and is used so robustly, I think that as a public library, we just want to go that direction. I know that in some cases we've used other software, especially for word processing, because it was free, right? It was like open source software. In some of those cases, though, we've had trouble translating the standard, which is Microsoft Word, in and out of that open source software that we were using in a public PC. So I'm just encouraging you to when you're looking at or evaluating software, think about what's the most usable for your staff and your patrons. And that's what you want to go with. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Another question, though, is it unique or special? And I would say things like our ILS software, that's an example of specialized software. So that limits our choices of what we can do. In terms of open source software, I want you to remember that, and I'm a big supporter of open source software, and that's software where the source code, the very heart and soul of that software, is open. It's open to anyone. And it's often free, but it's not free as in like free beer, right? It is free as in freedom. It's kind of like getting a free box of puppies or a free box of kittens. So it's awesome, right? What's nicer than a box of kittens or puppies? But there's also a responsibility that comes with having such a situation. And with open source software, that often means that it doesn't, they might have some quirks. It may not work completely refined or be completely finished. And for a lot of people adopting open source software, they're also committing to helping improve it through providing some level of coding and contributing that code or those experiences back to the community. So open source software is awesome, but it also has responsibility tied to it. So a lot of times in our public experiences, we don't go with certain open source software. I do want to say, though, that there's a lot that is refined and they are good packages. So I would encourage you not to have a firm standing either way on open source, but look at each software package and ask yourself, can we look at this? For instance, there's image editing software in competition with Photoshop, for instance, called GIMP, G-I-M-P. It's a graphics program. It's really good, and it doesn't cost anything. You can download it and do an awful lot of work with GIMP, and it doesn't cost. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Another thing that's really cool is to look at discounts. Please don't pay any more for software than you're required to pay. It's very hard. We have so many technology expectations. Software vendors know this, and oftentimes will give us discounts, being public institutions. And you've got a couple of different areas where you can take advantage of that. One is TechSoup. Many of us know about TechSoup as a source for discounted software. But there's also opportunities for many libraries to either get a governmental or an educational discount. So I want to encourage you to also find a vendor, even if you've already buying software through TechSoup, find a vendor who is able to offer clients, such as yourself, governmental and educational pricing. And when you're about to buy a commercial software package, check in with them and say, so based on the criteria that you have as a vendor, might we qualify for governmental pricing, or might we qualify for educational pricing, and see if those discounts offer you an advantage. As what I'd like you to do just on your own, this is just something for you to do on your own, is I want you to think about the types of software that you have and kind of run them through this criteria. So think about your ILS, think about operating systems, web browsers, word processors. I know it sounds obvious sometimes, but sometimes it's really interesting to go through these questions on things that sometimes we've already bought and ask ourselves, well, what is our reason for having this, and does this meet criteria that we have? It doesn't mean you're going to change anything radically, for instance, in some of these areas, but it will kind of warm up your brain in terms of thinking that you're a consumer of software services. You don't have technology being done to you, but you've got a reason to use these things, and it also helps you think about the pros and cons, especially as new opportunities come up. An ongoing part of our technical lives are updates, and you're probably crazy with updates, and I am too. Everyone I know is, but updates are necessary. One of the main reasons is for security, to make sure that our computing experience is secure. Security has become a major concern over time, and so software vendors are responding and keeping stuff updated and current. Another thing which I really love are bug fixes, and that's going back and checking and fixing things that were not operating correctly in the past. My favorite one, though, is performance improvement. Sometimes code is rewritten in a way that the software application runs better, faster, more efficiently than it used to be. Those are always my favorite. There's also the strategic considerations from the software vendor. I don't think it's a secret that all of our software vendors in our life would love us to be customers for life, and so they do things to kind of lock us into different channels. So I'll give you a couple of related examples. One is you've probably noticed that every major supplier of software services, whether they're Google or even a place like Amazon, Apple, they all have their own media company. It's because we all like to have streaming music, right? And so every one of those companies has also made sure that they have that offering to kind of make sure that if we're looking elsewhere, that they can take care of us just fine with what we're already doing. That's one of the ways that a vendor will try to keep us in their channel, in their sales channel, and keep us as customers and not looking elsewhere. I think it's interesting that about a year after buying the Beats headphone company, that Apple decided to eliminate the headphone jack, right? That means we're all going to need to go buy new headphones, right? If we're Apple users. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just saying that sometimes updates are part of a strategic consideration, and that's rolled into the package. Also, and we'll talk about this next, are new business models from the software vendor that they're looking at, and that's part of why the software is updated, to set the stage and then to pursue different business models. Updates are mostly good, but some, of course, are controversial. This is something that I want you to consider, just be really conscious of, that we really have a shift right now in terms of update models. Now, back in the old days, for instance, we used to pay to upgrade each operating system. Now we're seeing free operating system upgrades, and this really makes sense because our new operating systems, our newer ones, have all those other things that are awesome, right? They've got the bug fixes, they've got the performance improvements, they have strategic considerations often as well, but that makes sense for a vendor to want to give us that for free. Now, in another form, software that was purchased once, and we purchased software one time, we kind of stuck with that version. And when talking about this, I'm talking about getting a box of software, and then we would run it as long as we could until we had to upgrade, and that would happen a lot of time with Adobe products since they're relatively expensive. Now, the new model is an annual subscription or a standalone with periodic updates, with an emphasis on the annual subscription. And so Adobe was the first out of the box with this in making a subscription model where you have to pay every year to have access to lots of software, not just a couple of versions necessarily, but sometimes everything they make. But you only have access to it for that subscription period, which is usually like 1 year. Recently, Microsoft went to that model for the Office suite, Office 365, which is, it looks kind of awesome because you can get many different licenses for, $150 a year, but it only lasts for a year before you need to renew that license. And so that's a shift and that's a change. And not everyone is thrilled about that, but it makes sense, I think, from if we look at it from the manufacturers or the software makers' perspective, is by having this, it gives them good, steady revenue streams. It helps them predict how they'll fund their operations and make things better for us, and I think some motivation to keep us as subscribers to make their products better. So I'm not always happy when these changes happen, but I do have an understanding, and I hope you do too, as to why they do. Now, actually, that model of the subscription, we've had that for a long time with our antivirus, anti-malware vendors, and it made intuitive sense that we would have to keep paying them annually so that we have the latest updates on antivirus, for instance. So you might look at that as a comparison, but I think that we're going to have more and more shift to the subscription model as we go forward in time. It will never end. I know the question says, will it ever end? Well, no, it won't, because it actually makes sense. This is part of our environment. There's this churn that's always going on in the computer world, and that's something that I think it helps if we just get used to that and don't make it the point of our existence to hate it. Just accept it and to make it as efficient as we can. And one thing to take with you, I think, or to think about this philosophically, is this great quote from Future Shock, which is a very old book at this point, but this quote is so powerful, saying the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn, or make it easier. Just remember what Yoda said. But the idea is that our objectives a lot of times don't change a lot. The things, our goals and things that we want to accomplish don't always change an awful lot, but the way that we accomplish those will change when we're using computer technology. We have a handout too for you to look at. If a lot of times our updates for our operating system are automatic or they're built in, but just in case you haven't seen that, we want you to have access to the instructions in order to update your own computer. So be sure to take a look at that handout.